Of the Marathon County Human Resources Finance and Property Committee to order. The first item is Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, public comment. Nobody has approached either of us. So we will move on to the minutes from January 11th, which are in the packet. What are your wishes? Moved by Lemmer, second by Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. And Supervisor Zhang has indicated he's running a little bit late, and I think the others are on. So all right. We jumped on to 6A or B1. Resolution requesting the state to revise the current real estate transfer fees revenue sharing formula. And we have a resolution in the packet. Do you want to give us the background on, well, you received this. I was giving you your opportunity to shine.
WCA called and asked if we were going to take it up. So that's all I know about it.
So this has been running through a number of counties, and it's one of the items that the WCA's legislative agenda had identified as one of the items to work on. But basically, they're asking for a 50-50 split on the real estate transfers fees versus the current 80-20. I think it's self-explanatory. We have the dollars from Marathon County in here, and any discussion? Kurt?
Yeah, I think what, WCA's position is, these are low-hanging fruit. I mean, prior to 1981, as the resolution spells out, the agreed split was 50-50, and those transfer fees were split between the county and the state. We have ultimate responsibility for all recordings and all costs associated with that, so it was, in essence, a significant revenue source only for the state with very little requirement on their behalf for oversight or for work and operations. And over the years, when it moved to, in 81, when it moved to 80-20, you can see the significant difference in funding, and the funding responsibilities have just increased in Marathon County, and the number of people that we had dedicated during the acceleration of real estate transfers over the last couple of years. It's slowed a bit now, but required significant staffing. And so if this were to be facilitated, it would increase revenue to the county if the average over the last 5 years were to hold true future, about $400 and some thousand. So I think it's significant. WCA is asking each of the counties to potentially pass a resolution in regards to this.
So are there any questions? So it was a low-hanging fruit for the state to take when they had a budget deficit, and we're asking for it to come back when they have a surplus. Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just also wanted to mention that in the resolution it says in 2021, and I know that 2.5 billion in surplus is what was actually on the books, but I think their surplus coming into this year is above 6 billion. So they definitely have the funds to do this. And then also, I know this is slightly off topic, but we do have to have a discussion too about largely the shared revenue, because I know that that's a thing that the state legislature is talking about, and something we definitely need to discuss as we move forward. I think our county is probably in a better position than other counties, but this is kind of a little part of that larger discussion. So That's all I had to say. Thanks.
I think that's a good point, and perhaps we might want to just say, whereas in 2023, the state of Wisconsin has a projected budget surplus of approximately $6.5 billion. I think it's actually closer to 7, but
Yeah. Depending on whose projections, you could go as high, as high as almost 9 billion is now. There's some of the projections are out there, so, yeah, I think we need to clarify that to at least say the 6.5, because I think the state has, put those projections out. State agency.
so the slate is blank. What would you like to do?
My motion would be to approve with the change in the, whereas the projected surplus is 6.5 billion as of 2022, and move it to the full board for discussion.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the amendment as proposed, with the verbal amendments, will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you. All right, next item is, without objection, I'd like to just jump down to 7A, if that would be okay.
Sure.
And we'll just do an update on the tax deed process. And we thank Connie, you and Scott for being here. I don't know if you have any updates. I think what we wanted to do is just have a discussion on process and steps forward.
We were not, I don't know, I guess what this discussion is gonna be about, we don't know, so.
Yeah, if you could grab a mic. So I think what we wanted to do is, we've talked about historically trying to get our handle on a process, and I think what I'd like to do is just if we can, just talk about what the next steps might be in this, and I would just lay out a scenario for editing or comments. I think one of the things we need to do is understand how the law changed in last session affects us, and that change was in the past when we sold a property that we had taken, we could keep the proceeds. Now we have to turn it over to the homeowner. How might that impact us? What fees can we recover? Does it limit the county's cost in that? And I think, I know there's been some papers prepared for WCA and others, but we can look at that. We've had an ongoing discussion of whether we should continue to rely on tax deed versus NREM, and whether or not there are any advantages or disadvantages of making a change in how we go about taking title. I think we would like to know what those options might be. And then finally, I think what we'd like to do is discuss what do the statutes allow, what is our current policy in terms of our county ordinances, and what's our practice, and how do they mesh, and how should they be changed in light of the new law and the discussion of the status of the property moving forward. But are there other issues that you would like to see us address? And I think Mike and Connie and Kim and others will probably be relying on you for help as we go through this process. But I think what we want to do is find out, given the change in the law, what does that mean to us? And then statutory authority versus our practice. And can we tighten up some of those timeframes, move the properties through quicker so we're not at risk when we're buying the tax rolls on a regular basis, and sort of formalizing that process, and what is the best way for us to advance it in context of NREM versus tax deed. Does that make sense? Does anybody understand that?
So I guess I would ask, who is going to do the report as far as the law change and its impacts, and then who's going to provide, the pluses and the minuses under tax deed versus NREM, and then because if we don't assign it to someone, it's everybody's responsibility and it's nobody's responsibility. I think we had an expectation of some movement on some of the backlog, and I know we had a ER system in place, and that probably took up a lot of time of a lot of departments. But at the same token, I don't know that we've made any significant progress on the backlog, at least from the last report that we had. And so I would like to have it more specific as to who is going to provide that information, so that and then if there's any identified challenges to actually making progress, what those identified challenges are, and how do we actually make progress on the backlog.
Mike was sheepishly raising his hand as a volunteer, and my eyes went to him right away, so thank you for volunteering. I think what we would, when I look at this, I'm just going to interject. I think that obviously legal needs to be involved in the understanding of what we can do and what within the context of the statutes are. I think in the context of how it impacts us and what the backlog is relative to the delinquent properties, we would look to Connie in your office to do that. In the terms of the disposition of the property beyond, once we've taken the tax deeds, we would look to Kim to sort of be the champion of that. Obviously, there's some interrelationship and there are legal issues associated with every step of the process. But Mike, if you could look at it, Connie, if you could look at the perspective of what's our backlog, how many do we have, 2, 3, 4, or 3, 4, 5 years out and beyond? And Kim, if there are any issues relative to our transfer or sale once we've taken the deed, if we can sort of rely on you to fill those data voids or gaps.
And I think there's also a class of property out there that potentially has some environmental issues or some other reasons that we really don't want to take those properties. So let's identify those as a separate class if we can, and if there's challenges around them, what those challenges are, because I think there's special circumstances that may be unique to those properties, and how do we try to move them so that we're not continually settling on those with the other entities, and that comes directly out of revenue from the county.
I know that when I did work for the DNR, I would sit down with Lorraine and we would go through those with Lauren Brownback from Eau Claire and look at which might be eligible for a brownfield site assessment grant, other brownfield funding. And there are some funding sources that we might want to look at leveraging to try to address them, because as you indicated, that every year that we don't take it, they incur additional property taxes that we basically pay. And in some cases, if it's manufacturing, the state sets the valuation, and we wind up eating those costs. So I think that's a great idea, and I imagine we have a good understanding of which are properties of concern, so we can flag those and create a work, a work process by which we could look at those. Any other thoughts? Any questions? Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a question in terms of, does the committee have a decent enough sense of the change in the legislation, or, the folks involved in the process overall, to have a general idea of what direction the county's strategy would want to lean in? And the reason I raise the question is because I know there's lots of complicated stories behind each of these properties. I know there's lots of discussion around the fact that there is equity, that these property owners have with the properties, but, a county, if you look at it solely from a county's perspective and wanting to move properties quickly, it would help, and I don't know if we are prepared to talk about it today, to know if the strategy should lean more in the direction of moving things quickly, because if that were the case, then part of the work that we could bring back would lean in the direction of sort of, utilizing the committee's power to set the value of the properties. Just as an example, you could say, we're going to assess the property as a committee at the value based on the costs incurred by the county, and that's it. We're not going to try to generate profit, or we're not going to try to see what equity exists in terms of letting the market determine the value, whether that be through a online auction or otherwise. Because if we were focused on moving at least maybe some properties, you could move them quickly. You wouldn't worry about the generation of excess profit and then the paperwork and the 5 years waiting period in terms of trying to get that funding back to the individual. You could just move it at the cost incurred, and that would potentially incentivize purchases from people who are looking at it and recognizing that, okay, there is some equity here beyond the costs of the county. But from our point of view, it would move it more quickly, get it back on a tax rolls more quickly, and kind of address part of the issue in terms, and it doesn't have to be one or the other, but I guess that's kind of my question is the committee leaning in any particular direction, or would you like to see sort of, this is what this would look like, this is what, 2 or 3 different approaches would look like, based on a tax deed, not the in-rem piece, but just the process in light of the legislation changes? Because I think there are some ways we could facilitate moving things more quickly. And I've talked with Mike about this quite a bit. But if the committee has a sense of that, and everybody else involved in the process, it might help how we discuss this moving forward and what we bring back to you for consideration.
I think we want the options, and I'm a little hesitant to do much more than that today because we've noticed as an educational item, not a action item. And I see Mike nodding. But I think what we need to do is understand how that law has impacted us, and one of the ways that it's impacted us is that any incremental value needs to be treated differently than it was in the past, unless it was a homestead under certain conditions. So I think we need a better understanding of how that works in real life. Kurt, you were going to?
Yeah, I was just going to, obviously, prior to the law change, homestead property had a requirement that any excess equity, in other words, any equity that was above and beyond the county's claim to the property, the prior year property taxes, interest, and direct expenses associated with that property, would come to the county. The excess on sale would be claimable by the homeowner if it were homestead property. If it was non-homestead property, the excess property above and beyond the county's costs would come directly to the county. So it would be a windfall, if you would, to the county for the excess sale above and beyond county's costs on non-homestead property. Well, the legislature changed that law that now says, and I'm not sure, Mike, what was the time period that homestead property excess was required for potential claim by the property owner or previous homeowner? There was a period of time that they could claim that excess. But the law changed last year, and the law says now that any property that is taken and then sold, we can claim up to the expenses that we have in the property. Any excess is required to be held in escrow effect for up to 5 years for that property owner to claim that amount that was in excess. So to the deputy administrator's point, the question becomes, there was always incentive to get the highest price for all property because any excess for non-homestead property was a windfall to the county if it was taken by tax deed. Now, homestead property a little bit differently, but now there's no incentive for the county because any windfall, there is no windfall effectively. In fact, it may create an additional accounting challenge because we have to control or hold those excess funds in escrow for up to 5 years for the previous property owner to come and claim. So that's the discussion that the committee needs to be prepared to discuss. what process we potentially, I think that's what the deputy administrator is looking at. How does that change our previous process, which ultimately in the past looked for the most significant value there was in property when we took it?
And again, Kim mentioned that we lose money on most of our sales. So it is not a moneymaker. So if you look at it as a whole, we wind up, first of all, if we take too long to acquire the property, we lose anything beyond that 10th year. And then we lose, if we don't recoup our cost, we lose additional. If there are a lot of specials on it from the local government, we many times lose those.
And I guess, Mr. Chairman, if I might, I think that's the point. It is if the longer we wait, the bigger the opportunity is that the county is going to lose overall. But if we get a handle on and we decide that that's the route that we want to direct, is that take historically we've always worked with the property owner. We've created in some cases agreements, and as long as the taxpayers or the property owners paid the back taxes in the payment agreements that they've had, we wouldn't pursue taking the property as long as they continue to stay current with future property taxes. Now, but the point being here now is, do we want to continue to do that, or do we want to change that process, especially in light of there's no incentive for the county to actually receive additional profits?
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On a separate note, one of the challenges that I've recognized as I look through this is that, we utilize the health department for doing the environmental screens, which makes a lot of sense, and I think we would continue to do that. But part of what we could bring back too is either through a request for information or a potential request for a quote, looking at other third-party vendors that could complement their work, so that rather than getting the 20 to 25 properties that they can work within their calendar year, we could also explore how many more properties we might be able to approach. Obviously, other people have capacity, like the county clerk and the treasurer, which you need to fold into that. But if there were third-party vendors, as I understand it, the fees associated with that could then be put onto the deed as well. If we accelerated anything, that we could get a read on what that would look like for the committee, so that then if you decided to, you could then go and do a RFP for somebody to come in and do that as well.
I think one of the things we should also look at in the context of that is that the health department is at best a transaction screen. It's not an all appropriate inquiry standard. Number one, they're not trained to do it, and two, it's not complete enough, which is fine if we take it through tax deed because there's some statutory liability exemptions. But if you get into some of the federal funding and the federal law, there is an all appropriate inquiry standard. So we may want to just take if we're doing this, take a step back and look at are our efforts adequate to protect the county from liability in those scenarios, and if not, what would it take to get there, and protecting us from that environmental liability going forward. And I'd be happy to Mike, work with you on that. Kurt?
I think that's what I was referring to, is where's the capacity issues and where's the challenges, and if there's other options, what options are they, and so that we can actually make progress on this.
Any other questions? All right, thank you. And of course, you are welcome to stay. We'll go back then to the ARPA allocation process, and I put that on the agenda after our last meeting. I think that we all felt a little bit of guilt in subjecting people to a process that couldn't result in their receiving funding. While it was an interesting process and we learned a lot about community events, I think it had to be frustrating to many of the parties. And I think we need to get better at articulating that in addition to the Treasury meeting the Treasury requirements, we need to meet Chapter 59 and other requirements under state law and to look at the initial, Department of Treasury regulations and the intent of the ARPA funds. But I think before we go out and do any solicitations or entertain those, I think we need to bolster our understanding of what we're going to review and clearly communicate that to the public, that many of those projects were not home rule municipalities or local governmental units, were rather subject to the powers of the state. And Lance?
And thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to give you all a brief update, after that conversation you had at the last meeting, we did go on the website and change the ARPA project request information page, just to note that as of January 12th of this year, we're not accepting any more applications, alluding to the fact that we did receive a large number of requests and that the changing guidance relative to the allocation of those funds caused us to kind of pause that process. So just so you know, additional entities are not or should not be continuing in that application process based on the rationale you provided at your last meeting.
So I don't know that we need to do much more than that, but I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that we were looking at those. I think long-term, we need to get a better understanding of exactly where we are in our allocation. I think we're going to have some presentations in the next month or so relative to some potential options. And I think we have to figure, 2020, December 31st of 2024 is going to be here pretty quick. And we need to get those funds encumbered and with the potential for their use by 2026, or we lose them. And that would not be a good thing for the citizens of the county. Cora, Cody.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things I think would be helpful in that presentation, one of them was already mentioned, was what can we do with those funds? So that would be helpful to know exactly within the statutory guidelines of what we can do. And then also with the federal law too, because I know they have some restrictions on that. One of the other things I would like included on there is where we have allocated funds. I know we have like a good listing of all of that, but just to kind of categorize, one of the things I would be looking forward moving forward would be to make sure that we don't break any precedents that this committee has set in this term and the previous term when those allocations were going out. So, even with the information that we might have, we don't go beyond that. I'd like to keep within our precedents moving forward, and just having a good idea of where that is, I think would be helpful. Thank you.
Kurt?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that it really, the guidelines from the ARPA funding is fairly clear but fairly liberal, and it really is significantly different if you're using it under lost revenue or if you're not losing under lost revenue. I think that's the significant difference that we have to clearly understand. And having a discussion with our finance director, I think that if I remember right, she said by April or May we will have a new number for the new year as far as what the lost revenue has been calculated at. And if I picture the way that the lost revenue calculation is made, for almost all of the allocation that the county is going to receive will qualify under lost revenue. And so that is significantly, that then says that there's only very few limitations on the use of those funds. And those limitations are, in essence, they cannot be put in a rainy day fund. They can't be used to pay debt, and they can't be used to pay, retirement funding, I think was the other one.
Court settlements.
And court settlements. And so other than those restrictions, if it's under lost revenue, it's pretty broad, but it doesn't eliminate and this is the part that really became clear as far as challenges, is it doesn't eliminate the need to abide by state statute and what state statute allows us to do. So even though it is now broader than the ARPA legislation allows under lost revenue, it doesn't forego us the ability to not utilize the state statutes and the forbiddance that the state statutes provide.
It might be helpful too, to go along with Supervisor Hart's request, is to go through the process that we use. And we had a series of public hearings across the county and obtained feedback and just bring back what those priorities were based on that. Because I think those priorities were actually very consistent with where the Treasury guidelines ended up, and it might be worthwhile for us to look at that in terms of stimulating some thoughts on how we can advance proposals or consideration of proposals going forward. So we will do that at a future meeting.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I'll send out an email right after, or I'll try to do it during this meeting. But the National Association of Counties, as Chair Gibbs referenced, the rules at the national level that have come through Treasury are fairly broad, but the National Association of Counties has a good website that lays out those broad parameters of the American Rescue Plan Act and the state, more specifically the state and local fiscal recovery funds. With respect to Wisconsin law, as was referenced, we can send you a link to the very interesting read that is the Wisconsin statute, specifically Chapter 59, that lays out kind of the areas in which county government lives. But I'll send you those two links. I think they do provide some good background for the conversation you intend on having. And I don't know, Corp Counsel, if you have any other thoughts on what would be the appropriate information to perhaps have committee members review prior to that next meeting, as it relates to Wisconsin.
Sure. I just think related to this discussion, when we look at the county's authority to appropriate money, we're looking in Chapter 59, but there are also other statutes outside of 59. The county's authority lives all over in statute, but it is based in statute. So one of the difficulties in examining these requests is we often have to look at the request itself and see, okay, based on what they're asking for, is there a statute that permits it, instead of trying to outline every statute that potentially gives authority for the county to fund. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, not to try to overly complicate things, but I am a lawyer, so I guess that's my job, to overly complicate things. But that is, I think, a difficulty that we face, is not knowing what we're looking for in the statutes until we receive a request.
Any other questions?
I think that's what we had, Mr. Chair, that's what we had seen, in some of these, when we tried to evaluate some of the applications, was they're fact-based and specific to each request, and it required Corp Counsel to delve into the state statutes on each one, and each one might have had a different prohibition based on some different state statutes. So it's really unique to the request, and so to try to put out general information to the general public as to what can and can't, I'll give you a prime example of what I mean by that. Under the ARPA and federal legislation, it permits nonprofits, but under state statutes, our nonprofit ability to fund nonprofits is very, very limited, in that fact that we have to, in some cases, contract specifically for specific services. So even though it may be the best intended nonprofit there is, the county doesn't have the authority to do so. So I understand the want to have. I think the other thing that we need to have is a general understanding of what we as a committee want to direct, and for the full board to weigh in as far as the direction. Do we look at the underserved or the individuals, as the ARPA legislation indicated, the adversely affected populations, and and how do we identify them. I think in some cases, a lot of those adversely affected populations had special programming created for them. Small businesses, for example, housing challenged people, housing challenges, the individuals that had a moratorium on housing, and so I think it becomes very, very challenging to find the niche population if we can identify it that was adversely affected. And that leads me to where then I think the next round would go, and that is in general, because I think we heard this at many of those listening sessions, was expansion of broadband, and I think we've done a great job in comparison to where we were 12 years ago, and the progress that the Broadband Task Force has made, and the county's commitment to broadband expansion is significant. And I'll be the first to praise that in 2 weeks I'll probably have broadband at my house. Now it's not great. It's 2510, but that sure beats what I tested it this morning at 1.3 to 0.93. So the other thing that I think we need to look at is how do we, because the other thing that I heard at the listening sessions was, tax or potential reduction in tax, property tax for the property taxpayers of Marathon County. So that can be stemmed multiple ways. That can be looked at as far as capital needs for the county. That provides tax relief to everyone because it requires less borrowing. I think there's going to be some needs down at continued needs at NCHC in light of some of the funding challenges that the state has imposed. So I think all great discussion.
Anything else? If not, we'll put that together. And be back in touch, or be back on the agenda going forward. All right. That will take us up to Energy Task Force Charter. I'll turn it over to Supervisor Lemmer.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. One of your handouts. I'm an educator. I like handouts, so here we have one. I don't know, Mr. Chair, if you were able to email this to anybody online.
I've been trying to.
Okay.
frantically, and
So
I
those of you out in
am trying
Cyberville,
again.
hopefully it's coming soon. But this started when we were looking at the strat plan updates, and I had mentioned to John that I was a little disappointed there wasn't anything with energy, and he said, "Don't be disappointed. We are a committee. We can do this." So, but it really comes down to I don't know how big this needs to be to put it in a strategic plan. It's got to be defined. And I'm coming late to the party because I think energy has been on everybody's mind since the 90s. But I don't know what we're all doing. So I put this together, and I don't know how much you want me to go through it, but I think right now we've got a lot of funding streams that we could tap into. ARPA would be one, maybe the BIL, which I don't know how much we have already applied for, and then there's some new IRA monies. Anyway, if your energy bills are like mine at my house, they've gone through the roof. And I know Christy always says when we're working on budget, take off some zeros. Well, I can imagine we have to put those zeros right back on, and we need to do something. And I think the time is right. So what could we do? Well, if you read the Wisconsin Counties magazine from June of 2022, it's all on renewable energy, and they focused on Bayfield County, and that has kind of been inspiration, I think, and maybe a beacon that we can look forward to, because they started this in 2007 with just conservation. I assume we're doing conservation. They did things like put low-flow shower, water shower spigots in their jail and saved energy costs that way. They have different motion sensors and other lighting upgrades. They've got HVAC controls. I don't even know if we're doing any of that, and that would be a place to start. And if we're doing it, it would be, like you said, John, get it transparent so we know and we can see. Then they moved on to really alternative and renewable energy development. So they've been working with different partners, public, private, nonprofits, things like that, utilities, to actually put solar. And I think it said in this article that 40% of their energy costs are being provided by their renewables, which I think is something we should be looking for, but maybe we already have some of that going on with different energy recapture that we have. And then they're looking to the future to actually manage and then build resiliency into their energy so they're more independent. So I just feel like we could be doing some of that. And if we can start a task force to study it, in the duties and responsibilities section, I think the first thing is to get that baseline information. What are we doing? Identify where there are opportunities for mitigation and maybe even development and management of our own energy systems. Look at a cost-benefit analysis and looking for the shortest payback period with the best ROI, and then find some partners. Maybe that will lead to an RFP and a KIP project, I don't know, but green alert here, I'm going to need a little assistance and some partners myself. So, how's that? What are your thoughts?
And it just sent it to them, it finally went.
Okay.
So I think if you want to focus in on the duties and responsibilities, and Kurt, correct me if I'm wrong, but in order to form a task force, the executive committee and ultimately the county board need to approve them. So what we would be doing is if we wanted to advance this, making a recommendation to the executive committee, and then ultimately the county board, and then the appointments would be made by the county board chair in his capacity of under the rules. So.
And this
I
is
think-
a draft, sorry to interrupt, and I'm definitely looking for how to kind of get this more dialed in so that it's not as, green.
Well, in the recent federal changes are significant because in the past, local governments could never qualify for any of the tax credits. There are now provisions that would allow for the payment of those credits to local units of government, which is something that we just haven't looked at historically, and I see Chris nodding there, but I think it's worth the evaluation of whether we want to put solar panels on buildings, look at other energy efficient investments that might have a quicker or better payback, or switch from a marginal payback to a guaranteed payback, and I think it's worthwhile for somebody at a policy level to do that. Kurt?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think one of the things that, thank the supervisor for bringing this forward, because I think there's opportunity to understand what we are currently doing. I know when we design buildings, there is energy efficiency in mind when we design. In fact, that was a specific question on the design of NCHC, when NCHC with the major refurbishment, remodel was contemplated. There was a significant understanding of what energy efficiencies were going to be planned for in there. And so understanding what we're already currently doing, and then where is there opportunities for potentials in light of potential legislation that's just changed, and in light of where are there opportunities. Keeping in mind that the facilities and capital management may be the base for at least understanding what we're currently doing and what we currently have, and where there are potential opportunities. So I support the creation of a task force, and as the chairman alluded, I think the first step is to create the charter. The charter goes then to the executive committee. The charter then is, once the executive committee is fine with the charter, forwarded to the full board for its consideration. I think the deliverables are critical in identifying what a charter for a creation of a task force is for.
Cody?
Mr. Chairman, this is Supervisor Young. I just have a quick question.
Go ahead, Yi.
Oh, yep. Sorry. I noticed that there is obviously members that are on the that are outlined on there. Do we? I guess would it matter? How are we going to determine the chair or the who's going to be chairing the committee? Would it be someone from HR Finance because it's coming out of HR Finance? I'm just kind of curious because that's not written in there as well too. Just some clarification.
Kurt?
I would refer to the board rules. Our board rules indicate that the chairman appoints the chair of the task force, as I understand the rules.
So it'd be Kurt's appointment, subject to county board approval.
Correct.
Cody?
Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you. I really like this. I see that a lot of the things here is definitely stuff that's within this committee's control, but I don't think our committee, with everything else that we have going on, have the capacity to do this. So I think a task force is a really good way to analyze the full situation. So I'm very much in support of this. I've said before that I think we, as a county, need to make sure we mitigate our own impact on the fluctuating energy market, not just right now, but into the future. And I think doing this and evaluating the impact on our finances would have a really positive impact on the future of the county. So thank you.
Any other questions or comments? You feel if it's ready for movement, understanding that it can be refined at exec? What are your thoughts? Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not going to say anything new here, but I think that based on what we have in front of us and the conversation here and moving forward, it's just, from my point of view, the more focus any of the committees and the board ultimately give to the task force will certainly help in the launching of the effort, so to speak, so that, we're not entering into the room with sort of a scatter shot of what are we going to do. So, I mean, we have some clearly delineated items there under the duties and responsibilities. And my only comment is just to ask if there's anything the committee thinks might be missing, or if it wanted to focus more on one or the other. It might help the conversation as it moves through the process too, so that when it shows up, we can hammer those focus points right out of the gate, so that people know that part of establishing this, if it was established, is going to be addressing these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things, whatever they end up being, which doesn't preclude the task force from addressing other things at the start, or if it achieves all of these things and needs to add a couple later, that can all be done. But just to kind of help not only hone the work of the task force should it be created, but also the conversations we have around it as we move it through.
So we have a couple of options. We can work through that today and delineate it, or we can give it to you between now and the next meeting to mull over and refine those points. And then we meet next on the 8th of February. And exec doesn't meet until the county board day, the 16th. So we would be able to bring it in here, run it through exec, and potentially the county board. So do you have a preference in the context of the duties and responsibilities and really the outcomes at the end of the day? Do you want to, Supervisor Lemmer?
Well, again, green alert, I look at all of the things that we can do with solar and wind, and I don't even know, I'm hearing so many things about heat pumps, and I'm hearing about EV fleets, and that just seems like, holy cow, we got a junk drawer full of opportunity here. So maybe it would make sense, I don't know if, Chris, you would be willing to meet with me, just so we don't have to kind of mess around with everybody else's time and try and get it a little more dialed in.
Chris has got a thumbs up. Is there an objection? So what we will do is we will delay action on it today. Expect that it'll be on the agenda on the 8th as a more refined or updated process. And if there's agreement at the committee level, we would then advance it to exec for potential action in February. Kurt?
I have no objection to that. I would just add that if anybody, any supervisors have any recommendations, they forward them to Supervisor Lemmer and/or Chris because this is the first time the committee has seen that. So if there's some additional thoughts to try to get it focused, absolutely.
Is it possible to add this document into the packet? Oh, thanks.
Cody?
And I just had a question on process. So moving forward, would that be the charter for the task force that would be presented to us on the 8th? So by that time, the full charter would be, and then then we'd vote to advance that to exec and then go through the whole process. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we were moving this along quickly but diligently. Thank you.
So we'll work with a very quick eagle eye review from the from legal and make sure that we're doing that correct. And you didn't know you would be volunteered so many times today, did you?
I had a feeling.
Go ahead.
It just occurred to me, reading through the Wisconsin Counties Association magazine that was referenced and also some of the conversations that I'm having with colleagues around the state. I think when I look at possible membership, one other area that occurs to me, and of course it's ultimately up to the policymakers, but I think perhaps the Parks Commission would be another a good place to talk, either to have it included in the conversation, I should say, either the Parks Commission or someone from the Forestry Recreation Committee. Certainly there's a lot of discussion about carbon credits and how county forests can contribute to that, but also that those are some innovative areas for deployment of solar for carports and other venues like many of our park shelters. But just a thought for consideration.
All right. Anything else on this? But we can look at the membership, so please look at the membership. If you've got thoughts and suggestions, advance those to Supervisor Lemmer or to Deputy Administrator Holman, and we'll bring it back in 2 weeks. All right, thank you. We will then move on to the budget process. At your desks and included in the email that I just forwarded is a quick synopsis of what St. Croix County did this year as sort of a baseline for discussion. I know that Administrator Leonard was intrigued by that process, and I think what we heard from the county board is that there's a desire to become more involved in the front end of the budget process. So I threw out the St. Croix County approach as a beginning point for discussion on how we might be able to move ahead. But if you note in there as it relates to the operating budget process, in March of each year, they have a committee of the whole meeting to talk about presentations and future budgets, budget impacts, and begin that process. And that's complicated in a state biennial budget year because there are so many unknowns, but I think we have a good idea of what the baseline is, and we can always adjust it based upon what the legislature and the governor do at a later date. But I throw that out there for discussion. There are other counties that with administrative coordinators, which we do not have, but Lincoln County has, where there's a much larger role of the committees in actually developing some of those budget parameters in the budget themselves. With an administrator, it's his responsibility to present that budget. But I throw this out for discussion. And again, we don't need to act today, but I think we do need to, by the end of February, come up with a process that we would use to approach next year's budget. In addition to the operating budget process, we still have some outstanding issues that we need to resolve and get our arms around relative to the capital budget. Specifically, how do we deal with rolling stock? how do we deal with the whole issue of the IT software on a long-term basis, and what sort of funding mechanisms we will use. Historically, we've used the fund balance. That gets tighter and tighter as we move forward. Are there any policy issues that we might want to look at, or changes to the process? But I think what we would want to do is look at, when do we start engaging the county board in the discussion? When do we begin to start articulating our priorities? In this case, the county board adopts them in May. I like the St. Croix process as a baseline, but what are your thoughts? Administrator Leonard?
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chair. As the chair referenced, I was intrigued by the St. Croix County process, and, I think it starts at a very high level, and when you look at the department presentations, we kind of approach that in a different way. We have done that historically at the committee level, and I tried to do that this last year with, hey, what do you want more of? What do you want less of? Is there anything new you want? Is there anything you want to stop? To give, I think the committee, the whole process, and speaking with the administrator from St. Croix, it's really the opportunity for department heads to appear in front of the county board and give very, very short updates as to kind of what they anticipate seeing in terms of needs in the next year's budget, but also provide a real high-level overview of just generally what the work is that they do each day in their departments. We accomplish that through our budget book. I've tried to expand the information in that budget book to provide more of that insight. So I think that would be helpful. But then also really getting into the adoption of the budget priorities. In speaking with Ken Witt from St. Croix, he has a little bit of a matrix, and I can provide that at a future date, but essentially just ask really high-level questions. What are the priorities for the county? And they're very high level. Like, do you want service expansion? Because what that means is new positions. Or do you want to make sure that one of the priorities would be compensation for existing employees? Is that job one, is making sure that you have that competitive compensation scale in place. And just from the St. Croix County perspective, it's really dictated by what is the current situation, or what is the state of the county. And St. Croix, for those of you that don't know, has really experienced some rapid growth over the last couple of decades. So that's one of the reasons, one of their priorities has been that expansion of service. They need to add staff to accommodate the significant increase in population they've had over the last several years, which ultimately led to the construction of a new government center. They are previously authorized bonding. I believe that project is $80 million. So, that high level of what are the priorities, I think we sometimes get mired down in the details of what those priorities are, looking very closely at what do we project for our health insurance increase, what do you project in terms of compensation increase, and those things are really important, and staff can do that, but at a higher level, even having the conversation about what is that priority, what is the true priority, and then it corresponds to the matrix that Ken has used, and I'd be happy to bring those documents back, but I really do think having some additional clarity from this committee and ultimately the county board on what the process is that they would expect would be very helpful, because as I referenced last year in my process, absent direction to the contrary, I'm not only going to use the same process that we've used historically with some modifications that I think make it better, but I'm also going to present a budget that does all the same things, or attempts to do all the same things in terms of service delivery that we've done in previous years. So if we can kind of on the front end have those conversations, I see it as, it can only be a benefit.
Kurt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I struggle because those discussions did happen at each of those committees, and we did have a significant amount of new supervisors on the board. So I don't know that they understood when the question came to them what that meant. Meaning, the question came to the committee, do you want me to change, or what do you want me to change, and how that impacts the budget? So I think there will be a better understanding this year when that discussion happens at the committee level, that do you want to change, do you want more services, do you want less services? And if so, what changes are those? And that's the discussion, I think, that education over time has happened. So I don't want to throw out the total and create a whole new process, but at the same token, I welcome the opportunity to have those discussions, because I think the committee of the whole could get very, very cumbersome when you start having 38 board members in comparison to St. Croix County's board. I think it's significantly less. I think if not, it's in the low 20s. So that just becomes challenging when you have 20-some different departments coming ahead and presenting different opportunities and different things that they do. I think we do that at committee level, but I think, providing the education to the full board that says, look, this is your now area of purview. And when the administrator comes for the committee and have a discussion about what do you want more of or less of, is the appropriate time for those committees to enter into that discussion on how that impacts the budget. That's my thoughts.
I would disagree with a little bit of what you say. I think the value of the committee of the whole is that rather than operating within a silo, you get a holistic approach or a holistic picture of what's facing the county. That's the advantage of the committee of the whole. Whereas if you're only dealing with the committee, then you tend to look at my kingdom wants this versus your kingdom that wants that, and I don't understand your kingdom in the context of the overall fiefdom or whatever, but it makes it hard. So there is value in having the presentation at a higher level so that everybody has an understanding of maybe this year we aren't the most important because it may be highways, it may be the sheriff's department, it may be social services that have some special needs, and that would be the advantage of everybody hearing sort of what those challenges were early in the process. Chris?
I would just add one thing though, and I don't necessarily 100% disagree with that, but I think ultimately the committees are the area experts, and we hire a professional to develop the budget, and that's the administrator, and he has the holistic approach and the total picture of, because to try to sit there and have a total conversation about the total picture of the county and the services and the various departments, I think is going to be very challenging, because I still think that you're going to have committees saying, well, mine's still the most important. I'm not disagreeing, but I think that's what we hired an administrator to actually do when they develop that budget.
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we're talking about it, I've in my previous role, I worked with administrator, now DNR appointed Secretary Payne, on what they did in Sheboygan County. I know that I bring it up because it was referenced quite a bit during our budget discussions this past year. And I think their approach and St. Croix's and what we do already, I think that committee, the whole conversation, even in Sheboygan County, and I think this was left out of some of the conversation, was still pushed through their unique committee, their budget prioritization committee. So there's ultimately still a committee that kind of took the conversation from their committee of the whole meetings, and the way the Administrator Payne, described it to me was that process where everybody's hearing about it and getting, somewhat of an education about the different pieces, to your point about the silos, that at the end of the process, people could see their fingerprints on the discussion. They had already talked about it previously, and I think you're both hitting on those points there in the sense that you don't want to get too far into the weeds in that committee of the whole, but if you can have those conversations and then have those kind of work their way through this committee, executive committee, or however we handle it moving forward, then at the end of the day, you're not having the conversations on the eve of the budget adoption or this committee's meeting immediately prior to that, where people haven't seen their fingerprints on it and felt like they haven't been heard, maybe. And so all of that's coming all at once. And so I think that that's the benefit of having that broader discussion. But you can certainly work it through the respective committees and have that sort of, I won't call it vetting, but have those discussions so that people know they've been heard, I guess. And I think that if they understood, and this is again me sort of paraphrasing what I learned from Adam, is that if they bring something up that isn't ultimately adopted as part of the budget, they understand why before they're even at the budget meeting. And so that it doesn't preempt their concern necessarily, but it preempts some of the time that is spent on trying to hash it out on the board floor at the last minute.
Supervisor Leahy here.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Question, I guess, about the committee of the whole versus simply updating at full board meetings more frequently. I know that this last budget session, we did have quite a few updates in front of the full board as educational presentations, that sort of nature about where the budget process was. I think I remember Administrator Leonard coming before us after he had talked with department heads, kind of giving us some of those updates. Would it be helpful to increase the frequency of those types of messages to the full board? And would that be an opportunity for people to ask questions and weigh in without creating separate full meetings?
Let me try to, as I understand the St. Croix County approach, is that they present the information not to the board to establish priorities, but rather than they go back to the administrative committee, which in this case, in our counties, would be this committee, to develop those priorities that are then taken back to the county board for review and approval. Again, it's the issue of when do you present it. Cody?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one of the things with this committee of the whole, and Chair Gibbs mentioned this, we are the largest county board in the country. So I looked it up, St. Croix is 19. So for them to have a committee of the whole is a lot easier for them. I think one of the in-betweens that we could do, and as someone who went through this process for the very first time, maybe instead of a committee of the whole, we could do an educational presentation on the budget complete involvement. One of the things that I thought was funny going through this process was there was a lot of discussion of where did this happen, where did this happen, and it all did happen in the committee. And the example I keep coming back to is Social Services Department, where I say that I've probably seen that budget 3 or 4 times because I was in the Social Services Board. Then I went to Health and Human Services, then here, then the full county board. I think one of the things that needs to happen is for the process to be worked out, and maybe in that first educational presentation, we maybe set a timeline for the committees, and we tell the board, if you have input on this particular department, this is when this committee is going to have that discussion, or this is when that committee is going to set the budget priorities. I still really believe in that committee system just based off of the size of the board. And I do think that the board members should be able to give that input even if they're not able to attend those meetings, and should be informed how to do that. But they also have to take responsibility of doing that too. We have to have board members who are going to bring those ideas forward in the committees, or have the ability to send their ideas to the chair of that committee or to the administrator themselves. And I think if we, like I said, if we make that committee of the whole in the St. Croix process more of an educational presentation where we outline very specifically, this is where, when, why, how you can bring those ideas forward, they can do that. And then within that St. Croix process, then I would say that next step in April would be have all the committees within their jurisdiction make those recommendation of budget priorities, and then bring that to the full county board in May 3rd. And then just the last part of that is in county board adopts budget priorities. My question would be, what does that look like? Is that a resolution? Is that like similar to our strategic plan? How do we set that? Is that a document that we kind of debate on the language of? And then the administrator takes and creates the budget based off of, you know, the rest of the process. So that's just kind of where I see everything right now. Thank you.
Other thoughts? So what is our, you know, I think we've got a month to develop a process. Do we want to, you know, think about this and talk about it at our next meeting and try to see if we can nail down some timeframes and what that process might look like, whether it's committee of the whole, relying on other standing committees to set priorities and go forward? So I would, you know, is that what you'd like to do? Because we're kind of throwing this on you. I was trying to look at getting different processes from different people, and the Sheboygan County rules were from 2016, not the current rules. When you go and search online, or the ones that I accessed. So, you know, there is no one process. There are all sorts of processes we can look at to learn. Cody?
And I would be willing to work with administration, just as someone who is a new board member and went through this process for the first time, and kind of, I think maybe a good idea might be using St. Croix County as a base, and then seeing how we can adapt that to Marathon County specific board size and all those other things. And I think if we kind of come up with a process, bring that to the next committee, and then have that final discussion, bring it to the full board, I think that would be the best way to move forward.
Other thoughts? If not, we will move ahead, and we'll again put this on as a guide, not as our approach, but and if we have suggestions on how we can improve on it, those are welcome. All right. Next, we will go on to update on the potential change to state funding for municipalities. Kurt, I'll call on you because you've been tracking that as a representative of the county with WCA and others, and it's in the position. One of the reasons I put it on the agenda for today is because tomorrow we have the County Ambassadors Program, where counties will be in Madison and presenting the WCA's priorities for the upcoming budget to them, and one of those items is this issue, and wanted to make sure that you knew about it beforehand.
Well, I think to start out with, I mean, if you go back to 1987, the state's share of funding for counties and in more particular most municipalities, but counties in specific were 30. The state funded 46% of county operations. In 2019, that was down to 25%. So one of the challenges, and we have literally the most restrictive levy limits that there is in the nation. There is, bar none, the state of Wisconsin has the most restrictive levy limits that there is. So there was discussions at WCA that that's not sustainable long term. I think we all come to realize that with stagnant, effective shared revenue from the state, or in some cases even decreasing shared revenue from the state, that's not sustainable when the levy limits are net new construction at 2.5% for Marathon County for last year, roughly 2%, and you have inflation factor of 9%. That's not sustainable. And then when you have compound that over the relatively 20-year history that levy limits have been imposed, we're getting to the point where multiple municipalities, multiple units of government have gone out to referendum for requests for additional funding opportunities, or starts to impact the ability to deliver services. So the question at WCA was what, and the WCA is having with leadership in Madison, is what can we tie, or how can we tie the funding stream from the state to the financial viability and economic prosperity of the state. And so the state, really, the legislature and leadership in legislature says, there's three different areas of government. You have town government, you have cities and villages, and you have county government. You can't come to us with a proposal that's going to be objectionable by any one of the three. So all three have to agree on what the solution or potential solution is. And so the discussion centered around possibly using 1 cent of the state's sales tax, which now is tied to economic viability of the state. So as the state's economy increases, the state sales tax collection increases, and tie that to shared revenue to each of the municipalities. So that's where that's the high level of discussion that's being had. Obviously, one of the issues that we just talked about was also, in this case, was one of the fees that the county collects on real estate transfers. But at a higher level, the state shared revenue is being looked at as trying to tie it to the success of the state, the economic prosperity of the state, and with a safety net. And that safety net would sit there and say, okay, if the state goes into a recession, we can't impact counties drastically because that would create a negative impact on the ability to deliver services. Again, understanding that counties are partners with this, we partner with the state in delivering those services. Now, other municipality forms of government, the towns and the counties aren't quite as restricted. Under villages and cities, they have their own role of government. And so they have home rule, and that's a little bit more freedom. But in this case, the discussion that has centered around how do we tie that to sales tax. There's been some, high-level meetings that have taken place between the Towns Association, the Counties Association, and the League of Municipalities. So there is some potential agreements moving forward, and that's really where we're at right now.
By way of context, when you look at our aidable revenue portion of shared revenues, since 2014, we're down $98, but that's out of 3.8,777,619. So we haven't kept up with inflation. We've actually incrementally lost. The area that we do receive additional payments is in the utility property, and that's because the utilities, Weston facility generates a ad valorem tax that is shared with the counties in which they're looked at, because we're not taxing those as we would other manufacturing or other entities, and that's gone up $220,000 over that 10-year period of time. So we haven't kept pace with inflation, and our tax rate keeps coming down. And one other point, and then I'll turn it over to Kurt, but last year there were 37 public safety referendums in the state of Wisconsin, 20 on the ballot in November. 17 of those passed, which I think is one of the reasons why the governor is looking at trying to earmark the shared revenue increases to public safety. But there are concerns to all levels of government, some of which don't provide the public safety services. Kurt?
Yeah, I think just to back up your point, the utility tax, though, was an increase because of Weston 4 coming online. That gave us an additional utility. We were also put on notice that one of Weston's plants will be decommissioned. When that decommissioning happens, we will start to lose some of that utility tax, so our share of that revenue will actually decrease, and there is a provision that impact is shared over a longer period of time, but I think it's a 5-year period where that tax starts to decrease. So with that, I mean, when you start to see additional potential utilities coming into play, whether they be solar farms and or wind generation farms, if they're under 1 gigawatt, then there's no tax to the utility on those generations. So if the solar farm is generating less than a gigawatt of energy, they don't pay into the utility tax the same as the other utility generations.
So we're bringing it more for information and, so you're not caught off guard, and we'll probably learn a lot more tomorrow as to where it's going. But again, as the chair indicated, there are very complex negotiations and discussions that are taking place with legislative leadership, as well as the Town Association, the League of Municipalities, and the Wisconsin Counties Association to have a uniform front. And there's an opportunity now, given the surplus, and I think because of the long history of those levy limits having an impact on local governments and a critical need to do something different.
Just to give you another illustration of the challenges that the levy limits have imposed, was it 3 years ago, 60-some counties in the state had a increase in their health insurance cost that exceeded the levy limit increase that they could take. So if you think about that, the amount of levy that they could increasingly take to the max was their health insurance increases exceeded that. So that left nothing for wage increase, left nothing for inflation on any aspect of utilities or what it was. And so those, like I say, are continually putting the challenges on local units of government to be able to deliver services in a more effective way. One of the things that one of the requirements that leadership is potentially thrown out there is the ability, or they're talking about a requirement for municipalities to look at the way to deliver services in a more cooperative way. So looking at where is there opportunity to share in the delivery of those services, whether they be across county lines or whether they be across municipality lines, is one of the things that they're wanting to encourage. At least leadership is looking at and saying there's incentives there that they may want to try to create the incentive for municipalities, including counties, to look at similar situations such as North Central Healthcare, where we have a 3-county entity providing services. So,
Cody.
Thank you. Kind of going off of that, I've been paying attention because suddenly I have a vested interest in this, serving on the committee. And I know a lot of the discussion is between Milwaukee County and the state legislature. And one of those ideas was, to kind of force reform was to require the city of Milwaukee County to consolidate departments. One of the things that we need to point out here is we already do a lot of that here in Marathon County. We have a consolidated Parks Department. We have a consolidated IT department. So even here in Marathon County, where we're doing that, we're still struggling. And I view this as, if you look at the graph up there, you know, we've almost, the state aid since 1987 has gone down, not quite, but almost by half. But the mandates that the state requires us to fulfill haven't gone down, and if not, increased since that time. So it's really an unsustainable path, and something needs to be done, and there needs to be reform, because I think the article I read here said that some counties are, within the next 10 years, looking at some municipalities, I should say, are looking at like fully going bankrupt, essentially, if something major doesn't change. And I know we're probably not anywhere near that, but I think that just kind of points to the urgency of this. Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Again, we wanted to bring it to you in advance of the presentation to the legislature, and we'll keep you posted. And I think we'll hear more tonight, I would imagine, in the governor's State of the State address as he starts to outline some of his budget priorities in advance of the February presentation of the budget. And I know that there have been ongoing efforts with all parties, the governor's office, the leadership in both the Assembly and the Senate to work on something.
John, just one. And WCA has not, just talked to legislative leadership. They have had discussions with the administrative side and the governor's office. So all are, I think, cognizant of the fact that something needs to change, but something needs to be, sustainable long term, and that's what's trying to be looked at is what does sustainability look like without because one of the key points that some legislative leadership is saying is, property tax increases or the reduction or the elimination of levy limits is really not probably on the table for discussion.
Anything else? If not, we're now at the report everybody's been waiting for, and how the ERP rollout is going.
Ooh, me.
Well, you get that one.
Go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll keep it relatively brief, but happy to answer any questions. You may recall that, prior to the end of last year, the first go-live for the county was essentially getting payroll lined up for employees and also getting that initial orientation, getting into Workday, updating contact information, things like that, beginning to get more comfortable with the system and what it's ultimately going to be doing for us. And, from my perspective, and I was more involved with that than, with Christy and the finance side right now, but from my perspective, that went very well. Most issues quickly became sort of one-off situations. There weren't sort of fundamental, massive flaws that you needed to address to make it work. It was just unique work rules, or the back-end calculation wasn't quite capturing a holiday rule in a particular way. So we could identify those pretty quickly. The department supervisors and managers were very good about communicating what they were seeing, and Christy and her team and HR and their team really worked well together, because especially with payroll, there's bits and pieces from both of those departments to make that work. And similarly, we hadn't to that point operated in a live environment, so it was a rapid shift from a lot of work and discussions around the back-end configuration and building the thing, and then ultimately getting into that live environment kind of highlighted, okay, here are the areas that we needed to work on. And we did, to our credit, I would say, ask to get into that live environment sooner, but I guess it's somewhat standard practice that you don't get it until the day before you go live. So nevertheless, there was a lot of activity in those first couple of weeks for that first payroll period, getting everybody's payroll into the system and then working through the various calculations, and I said those sort of one-off unique situations to make sure that they're processed. And then after, sort of your standard county employees payroll, there were the integrations for the sheriff's office through IntelliTime and highway through RT Vision. And so once the bulk of the payroll had been sort of submitted for most folks, then the work shifted to, okay, let's get those integrations over and let's see what the issues were there. And so then again, Chrissy and her team were, instrumental in identifying those. Similarly, Darren White and Kendra Molly and folks at Highway did a good job of kind of getting some highway workers to test the RT Vision integration before it transferred over to their department to really fold into the payroll. And that went well too. There were some issues to work through, but I think those would all fall under the umbrella of what you would expect in an implementation like this. Let's see. There were fewer issues to resolve for the second pay period, and now we're heading into the third pay period. And so I think that side of the implementation is beginning to settle into more of a routine thing. There's still things we're working on, but generally speaking, the lion's share of issues are mostly resolved. And now we're kind of looking back at, I guess I could put it this way, in those first couple pay periods, the mindset was really like, what's the issue? We need to fix it now. But now we've got a little more brain space on the payroll side anyway to say, okay, well now rather than making some big sweeping change on the back end to address a situation, what are the tools that we haven't used yet within a system that we can utilize to then resolve that without that back end stuff? So the mindset shift helped to kind of take a step back, see the horizon and say, okay, here's what we should do for this rather than trying to find a workaround, which we were doing a lot of in that first week or two. But yeah, nothing major from the payroll side. Then finance went live when we all came back from the holiday in the new year. Prior to that, Chrissy and her team had put together some sneak peek meetings for financial managers and others so they could kind of see how it worked and watch it be done on the screen and ask questions, or how do we do this, how do we do that. So that was a good preview, if you will, of what they would ultimately be doing. And then that helped to set up additional trainings in the lab environment. So having people bring an actual invoice they needed to process, for example, to a training where they can ask the question and then actually apply it live. I think that was a useful approach, and help people also sort of either bring other issues up that had been brought up previously that hadn't been addressed yet, or to kind of say, well, this isn't working, or how do I apply this particular unique part of the system to this to make it move. There were a couple of major issues that did require a lot of assistance on the financial side from the consultants, and from my perspective, and Chrissy can give more info if she wants, but once we identified what the issue was, the consultants stepped in to figure out what had happened, and then more or less watched very closely as we test ran like smaller iterations to see, okay, what is the flaw here? And so there's still in that area, in a couple of those areas, the consultants are still kind of hand-holding those along the way. But the good thing is that they are known issues. We know what is happening, and we know that it's something on the integration side, on the build side. It's not something that we're doing on our end. It's more like how it was built. And so the emphasis right now is on the consultants really hammering that out, and then us then applying the operational lens to say, okay, we did it again, but this happened. And so that back and forth is working pretty well. And, communication has been very, very good from my perspective. The next steps, for example, for HR, include moving to other areas within the system, because there's lots of processes within HR that are going to move from a paper process to something integrated within Workday. And so those and other areas were put off on purpose to get through these major pieces of, sort of the fundamental, what we need the thing to do, and get those done and set up. And so HR is beginning to move into that, and presumably finance will have some areas to look at too once they get past their hump and get to where payroll and HR has been for the last couple of weeks. And paper will still remain for some processes as we move forward, but again, these are things that we've talked about, and we have weekly steering committee meetings, we have daily finance meetings to talk about what people are seeing, and and everybody who's involved in the project is discussing what's been going on, and so you have that daily check-in to make sure that we're resolving things as they go. We had a phase 2 steering committee meeting this week where A lot of the big pieces I'm mentioning are more the phase one. Phase two are some of the things we knew we pushed off, but also need to resolve, even including, a couple outstanding bugs that weren't really going to be a part of the phase one issue, but still need to be resolved at the end of the day. And we're also looking at moving ahead with some discussion around extended support from the consultants, for a few more weeks or hours, really, when we talk about it on our calls. And then at that same call, we had some post-implementation discussion about what other support is there, do they offer. Now, we haven't entered into any of those agreements, but we're at that part of the discussion where, okay, for year one, this is what that looks like, year two, and then after a year at least, you'll have a much higher comfort level with the system as a whole. And so we're still in the very beginning stages, but on the whole, minus a couple of instances recently through finance, which again, I've been saying have been getting a lot of attention, the implementation has gone very well, all things considered. I think that I already mentioned the daily finance calls that are ongoing. We have the weekly calls, and we also have other calls as needed. So if there's something unique that pops up, we talk to the consultants, get whoever is their expert on that area, and then get a call set up with the parties that need to be on it and sort that out. So we'll continue moving forward. I think, again, from my perspective, any of the issues that are still outstanding are known, and that's more than half the battle in this situation. But I think that once we get finance ironed out and the fundamentals are working the way they should, then we'll have the big pieces out of the way, and then everybody can start, and by everybody I mean not only employees, but the project leads who have been incredibly involved in all the back-end work, and then now this implementation piece will be able to take that step back, hopefully sooner rather than later, but generally speaking, I think we're in a good spot.
Kurt?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The one thing I want to, because I have had to get some training also on some of the processes that I'm responsible for. I want to thank, the Finance Department, Chris and his lead, and all of the departments that have worked on this. But I want to also temper a little bit the expectations that some people have presented to at least come to my forefront, and that is some of the expectations that we'll be able to provide projections, we'll be able to provide comparison budget versus actual. We will at some point, but I want to temper those expectations that those are, where we need to be able to crawl before we walk and walk before we run. And this is a huge undertaking, a huge changeover. And I think the staff is put in a tremendous amount of overtime, in a tremendous amount of effort to get where we're at, and we've made some great progress. But I want to stem the expectations that next week we'll be able to have a comparison of last year's budget or this year's actual to budget numbers. So I would throw this question to Christy. Do you have any kind of indication as to when, obviously we're in the middle of the audit also, and so that and the operational day-to-day operations is clearly littered with opportunities for improvements. When the committee could potentially start to see some of those numbers, some of those reports that some people are already calling for, I'm trying to hold them off and say, look, that may be middle of the year, or so I'm asking that question.
Right now, what we're trying to do is get all of our year-end stuff done, and I want to thank. I've had people that retired and have come back to help us. That people that work for us that feel this is a really great place to be. Employees in all of the departments are, I'm sorry, you're really busy. Can we help? We've had some that we've had to fix errors on, and we try to do them in priority order, dollar amount and severity. But they've all been helpful. We've asked everyone that has a question, email us. And they email us. The question is sometimes something that they looked at in Workday that has been the same way it was on their payroll in Kayenta, but it gives them the chance to look and ask questions. So one thing I do want to thank is not only that our teams have been working, but all the employees that have been patient with us have asked questions. We said, if you have a question to ask, they aren't all answered right away because we have to figure out which, the fires are the biggest we take care of. So I do want to thank all of our Marathon County employees, all of our partners at the help desk, at data center. We are working with the city. Some things come up with us because we went first. So we've blazed the path through the jungle or through the mountain or climbed the mountain first. And we told them, oh, by the way, it doesn't work right now. And we fixed it. You're welcome. And it's okay. So I do want to just let you know that we really appreciate all of the people that helped. Next steps is getting our year-end stuff done, which we've got people working on. The second week of February, our consultant's going to be working on reports with us and uploading budgets. So at least get us through February, because that is actually the next part of it. We have a really excellent consultant that works with us who used to work in a government, and she is coming on site and will be working with us. And from there, we can go from there. But again, I want to thank all of our employees because they have been extremely patient. When we've asked them to send us emails, they do, and we are trying to get them all cleaned up and taken care of as well. So I really, really, really appreciate the great people we have working here because it's really been hard but easy when they ask us stuff and we can help them out.
Christy, I want to just reiterate the appreciation that we have for you and for your team and in the HR department, and all the employees that have worked on this rollout and implementation, and we thank you. When do you think that we'll be shutting down Kayenta and moving forward?
I thought Christie wanted to move back to Kayenta.
No, but it works. So we're kind of in this phase of working. Actually, that's a question for the final date would be with IT. They have a contract with them, but we are looking at our audit is the last week of April, and so we want everything closed and wrapped up by Memorial Day. But we believe that everything needs to be filed with the state by July, so June 30th at the very, very latest. But that really is contractual with what they work out with Kayenta and the IT department. So May for sure, and if things are hanging out, we'll do a little after that. But really nothing in 2023 will be in there. It's just really the follow-up and finalization of 2022.
Kurt?
Yeah, from what I understand is CCIT contracted through the end of June for Kayenta support. So I think the end of June is the, right now, is the projected turn-off date, but that's provided everything goes well and we get all of the audit done and everything else.
Any questions? Again, thank you for that update. We've been having lots of expectations that on January 2nd we would have reports, and I think it takes a little bit longer to roll out, and we appreciate the efforts, the overtime, the frustration, and the progress. Any other questions? If not, thank you for that update, Chris and Christy. Our next meeting is on February 8th. Does anybody have any items that they'd like to deal with at that meeting or other subsequent meetings? I know we're still working on the TIF. We'll bring that in. We'll be following up on some of the items from today. And we'll be dealing with a lot of the transfers and other things that are normally before us. Other items? If not, we're at item 9. Yi, are you still there? Because that's your... All right, who would like to make that motion?
Move to adjourn, Mr. Chairman.
Moved by Chair Gibbs. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, no. Thank you all.